Hi, hi. Hey, y'all. This is Esmee. I am the founder and editor of Medusa Rising, World Building Women, a radical digital materialist feminist project. And I'm recording this the same day I recorded our first episode because I'm in a little bit of a hurry. Um, I'm going to start a series of posts on fascism, radical materialist feminism versus the fascists, I guess you could say. Um, and I was reading this. This is Albert Camus The Rebel, which is his sort of historical study of rebellious thinkers and rebellious actions from the Marquis de Sade all the way up to his own moment after World War II. Camus is one of those very famous existentialists. A lot of people think the existentialists are the people who told us that life has no meaning. But that's not really the case. What the existentialists told us was that we broke meaning, and so now we're going to have to make it for ourselves. What broke meaning for the existentialists was World War II. This is the generation that lived through it. This is the generation that fought in it. They were in POW camps there. They were injured, or they were sort of trapped in a German-occupied France. Most of them were French. And Camus is, rather than one of the people who says that life has no meaning, he is one of the world's great humanitarians. He is one of the great believers in our ability to deepen and expand our humanity. Right over here, poster of his most famous quotation reads that the only way to deal with free world is to become so free that your every act is rebellion. He was not into complying with authoritarians and totalitarians and fascists, orange men, their weird billionaire friends. That series of posts has a lot to do with the neo-reactionary movement, I think a large part of today's ascending far right internationally. And I wanted to go back to one of the beginnings of the rebellion, to Camus. He's thinking in this little section of the book, this is like way deep in, this is page 176. He's talked to us about the German romantics and the English romantics and the surrealists and Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche, of course. I've discovered in his reading of Nietzsche the secret that made all of my professors and some of my favorite thinkers as I was a student, like what made all of those people make sense to me. And it was that we all sort of intuitively share Camus' reading of Nietzsche, which is that he was not in fact a nihilist. And he was not in fact just about the will to power. Although many of his adherents, Hitler, Musk, Curtis Yarvin, are about the will to power. So I want to read to you and let you hear the echoes and the sort of total emotional connections reverberating through history for these people. It's not to say that they are Hitler. It's just to say that, like, they would get along at the pub. So this chapter from The Rebel is called State Terrorism and Irrational Terror. It's going to appear next to, I think it's part two. Of my little series on it's fascism, new rules, because fuck these assholes, right? All modern revolutions, Camus tells us, have ended in a reinforcement of the power of the state. This is a key thing for us to understand, right? 1789 brings Napoleon, 1848, Napoleon III. 1917 brings Stalin. The Italian disturbances of the 20s give us Mussolini. The Weimar Republic gives us Hitler. These revolutions, particularly after the First World War, had liquidated the vestiges of divine right, still proposed with increasing audacity to build the city of humanity and of authentic freedom. The growing omnipotence of the state sanctioned this ambition on each occasion. It would be erroneous to say that this was bound to happen, but it is possible to examine how it did happen, and perhaps the lesson will follow. Apart from a few explanations that are not the subject of this essay, the strange and terrifying growth of the modern state can be considered as the logical conclusion of inordinate technical and philosophical ambitions. Technical and philosophical ambitions. The surveillance state, right? The internet gulag we all live in now. Oh, danger of losing our place. Foreign to the true spirit of rebellion, these technical and philosophical ambitions. Foreign to the true spirit of rebellion, but which nevertheless gave birth to the revolutionary spirit of our time. That is, the revolutionary spirit of our time is inverted, collapsed, upside down, living upside down. The prophetic dream of Marx and the over-inspired predictions of Hegel or of Nietzsche ended by conjuring up, after the city of God had been razed to the ground, a rational or irrational state, which in both cases, however, was founded on terror, as we are coming to know more and more across more and more states just right now. In actual fact, the fascist revolutions of the 20th century do not merit the title revolution. They lacked the ambition of universality. Mussolini and Hitler, of course, tried to build an empire, and the National Socialist ideologies were bent explicitly on world domination. But the difference between them and the classic revolutionary movement is that of the nihilist inheritance. They chose to deify the irrational and the irrational wrong instead of deifying reason. In this way, they renounced their claim to universality, and yet Mussolini makes use of Hegel and Hitler of Nietzsche, and both illustrate, historically, some of the prophecies of German ideology. In this respect, they belong to the history of rebellion and of nihilism. They were the first to construct a state on the concept that everything is meaningless, and that history is only written in terms of the hazards of force. The consequences were not long in appearing. Sound familiar? All these men of action were surrounded by them. As early as 1914, Mussolini proclaimed the holy religion of anarchy and declared himself the enemy of every form of Christianity. For Hitler, his professed religion unhesitatingly juxtaposed the god Providence and Valhalla. Actually, his god was a political argument and a manner of reaching an impressive climax at the end of his speeches. As long as he was successful, he chose to believe that he was inspired. In the hour of defeat, he considered himself betrayed by his people. Between the two, nothing intervened to announce to the world that he would ever have been capable of thinking himself guilty in relation to any principle. Does that personality, that way of thinking about the world, remind you of anyone? I mean, I don't want to be too on the nose about it, but if he succeeds, it's because he's chosen by God. And if he fails, it's because he was betrayed. And he's never wrong. He never does anything. Who's that? The only man of superior culture who gave Nazism an appearance of being a philosophy, Ernst Jünger, went so far as to choose the actual formula of nihilism. The best answer to the betrayal of life by the spirit is the betrayal of the spirit by the spirit. And one of the great and cruel pleasures of our times is to participate in the work of destruction. I mean, you could hear that coming out of Stephen Miller or Steve Bannon's mouths, right? Like, it's essentially the heart of their philosophy, their approach to the world. Men of action, when they are without faith, have never believed in anything but action. Hitler's untenable paradox lay precisely in wanting to found a stable order on perpetual change and no negation, only forever upward transcendence without critique, without vision, without challenge. Accelerationists, anyone? Sorry, I got a phone call. I had to stop the video for a second. Let me start this paragraph again. Men of action, when they are without faith, have never believed in anything but action. Hitler's untenable paradox lay precisely in wanting to found a stable order on perpetual change and no negation. Forever, ever churn, ever churn. Rauschening, don't worry about the names of all these people, Rauschening, in his book, Revolution of Nihilism, was right in saying that Hitlerian revolution represented unadulterated dynamism, just constant motion. Not really sure where it's headed, but constant motion. In Germany, shaken to its foundations by a calamitous war, World War I, by defeat and by economic distress, values no longer existed. Although one must take into account that Goethe called the German destiny of making everything difficult, the epidemic of suicides that swept through the entire country between the two wars indicates a great deal about the state of mental confusion. This was a profoundly lonely people Hitler used to control. To those who despair of everything, not reason, but only passion, can provide faith. And in this particular case, it must be the same passion that lay at the root of the despair, namely humiliation and hatred. Does this sound like the politics you are familiar with right now? A people rendered immobile, right, in Timothy Snyder's sense, and helpless and stuck and drug addicted, unemployed or underemployed and unable to get anywhere, constantly being ground down in the demands of this never-ending trap of neoliberal capitalist profit, right? They can't have what they're supposed to have. What they're supposed to have is the fruits of their labor. But everything is becoming more and more and more impossible for them. Here in the United States, right, among these very people, suicides have been skyrocketing, especially since the pandemic. So here comes Trump, right on top of a heap of economic and personal despair across great swaths of the United States. And what does he give these people who have lost their faith in our democracy, maybe in our way of life? He gives them a passion that is equal to that despair, the understanding of their humiliation and hatred. Hatred of all of these others, the successful, the foreigner. There was no longer any standard of values, both common to and superior to all these men, in the name of which it would have been possible for them to judge one another. The Germany of 1933, thus, agreed to adopt the degraded values of a mere handful of men and tried to impose them on an entire civilization. Deprived of the morality of the German poet Goethe from the 19th century, Germany chose and submitted to the ethics of the gang. Gangster morality is an inexhaustible round of triumph and revenge, repeat and resentment, defeat and resentment. When Mussolini extolled the external force, the elemental forces of the individual, he announced the exaltation of the dark powers of blood and instinct, the biological justification of all the worst things produced by the instinct of domination. At the Nuremberg trials, Frank emphasized the hatred of form which animated Hitler. The hatred of form, the hatred of anything constraining or regularizing, or that set an ability for people to look at it, take perspective, and add a demand or add a judgment to any other position or any other place. See, the thing everybody's always accusing the existentialists and the post-structuralists of believing, That's what Hitler and the other fascists of the 20th century were actually up to. What Camus is writing here is not a defense of meaninglessness, but a critique and understanding how very dangerous it is. It is true that this man was nothing but an elemental force in motion, directed and rendered more effective by calculated cunning and by a relentless tactical clairvoyance. Even his physical appearance, which was thoroughly mediocre and commonplace, was no limitation. It established him firmly with the masses. Action alone kept him alive. For him to exist was to act. That is why Hitler and his regime could not dispense with enemies. They could only define themselves, psychopathic dandies that they were, in relation to their enemies, and only assume their final form in the bloody battle that was to be their downfall. Psychopathic dandies. Let's put that in our back pocket. The Jews, the Freemasons, the plutocrats, the Anglo-Saxons, the bestial Slavs succeeded one another in their propaganda and their history as a means of propping up, each time a little higher, the blind force that was stumbling headlong toward its end. Perpetual strife demanded perpetual stimulants. Hitler was history in its purest form. Evolution, said Junger, is far more important than living. Think about these neo-reactionaries and these accelerationists, right? Their way of looking at humanity is just kind of a mass of labor and resources. Thus, he preached, Junger that is, complete identification with the stream of life on the lowest level and in defiance of all superior reality. A regime which invented a biological foreign policy was obviously acting against its own best interests. But at least it obeyed its own particular logic. Rosenberg speaks pompously of life in the following terms. Like a column on the march, and it is of little importance toward what destination or for what ends this column is marching. You hear? That's the nihilism that people accuse, or the relativism even, that people accuse the existentialists and the post-structuralists of advocating. Indeed, they do not advocate it like the Frankfurt School. They are its enemy. Though later the column will strew ruins over the pages of history and will devastate its own country, it will at least have had the gratifications of living. The real logic of this dynamism was either total defeat or a progress from conquest to conquest and from enemy to enemy until the eventual establishment of the empire of blood and action. It is very unlikely that Hitler ever had any conception, or at least at the beginning, of this empire. Neither by culture nor even by instinct or tactical intelligence was he equal to his destiny. Germany collapsed as a result of having engaged in a struggle for empire with the concepts of provincial politics. Is this feeling real familiar to you right now? Germany collapsed as a result of having engaged in a struggle for empire with the concepts of provincial politics. But Junger had grasped the import of this logic and had formulated it in definite terms. He had a vision of a technological world empire, of a religion of anti-Christian technology. Anybody here? Anybody hearing the echoes of Curtis Yarvin here? Yeah, this is the man's home. This is where his brain is born. A religion of anti-Christian technology, of which the faithful and the militants would have themselves been priests because, and here Junger rejoins Marx in his thinking, on account of his human form, the worker is universal. The statutes of a new authoritarian regime take the place of a change in the social contract. The worker is removed from the sphere of negotiation, from pity, from literature, and elevated to the sphere of action. Legal obligations are transformed into military obligations. It can be seen that the empire is simultaneously the factory and the barracks of the world, where Hegel's soldier-worker reigns as a slave. Hitler was halted relatively soon on the way to the realization of his empire, but even if he had gone still farther, we should only have witnessed the more and more extensive deployment of an irresistible dynamism and the increasingly violent enforcement of cynical principles which alone would be capable of serving this dynamism. Speaking of such a revolution, Rauschening says that it has nothing to do with liberation, justice, and inspiration. It is the death of freedom and the triumph of violence and the enslavement of the mind. That's what Rauschening is writing. The death of freedom, the triumph of violence, and the enslavement of the mind. Fascism is an act of contempt, in fact. Inversely, every form of contempt, if it intervenes in politics, prepares the way for or establishes establishes fascism. It must be added that fascism cannot be anything else but an expression of contempt without denying itself. Younger drew the conclusion from his own principles that it was better to be criminal than bourgeois. Hitler, who was endowed with less literary talent, but on this occasion with more coherence, knew that to be either one or the other was a matter of complete indifference, from the moment that one ceased to believe in anything but success. Thus, he authorized himself to be both at the same time, both the criminal and bourgeois. Again, the echoes of the Orange Mussolini, the Volgan candidate, right? Thus, he authorized himself to be both at the same time. Fact is all, said Mussolini, and Hitler added, when the race is in danger of being oppressed, the question of legality plays only a secondary role. Moreover, in that the race must always be menaced in order to exist, there's never any legality. I am ready to sign anything, to agree to anything. As far as I am concerned, I am capable, in complete good faith, of signing treaties today and of dispassionately tearing them up tomorrow if the future of the German people is at stake. Anything, right? Any move, anything to get in the direction I think serves me, and through me, my people. Before he declared war, moreover, Hitler made the statement to his generals that no one was going to ask the victor if he had told the truth or not. The leitmotif of Goering's defense at Nuremberg trials returned time and time again to this theme. The victor will always be the judge, and the vanquished will always be the accused. That is a point that can be certainly argued. But then it is hard to understand Rosenberg when he said during the Nuremberg trials that he had not foreseen that the Nazi myth would lead to murder. When the English prosecuting attorney observes that from Mein Kampf the road led straight to the gas chambers at Maidaneck, he touches on the real subject of the trial, that of the historical responsibilities of Western nihilism, and the only one which, nevertheless, was not really discussed at Nuremberg for reasons only too evident. A trial cannot be conducted by announcing the general culpability of a civilization. Only the actual deeds, which at least stank in the nostrils of the entire world, were brought to judgment. But I don't know. As a radical materialist feminist, as someone who wants to go build out in the froth and bubble of the margins, maybe a trial can be conducted by announcing the general culpability of a civilization, if that civilization has failed in its solidarity to such a degree that men decided that women were a resource for their own projects. Just another bit of earth to be toiled, plowed, right? Taken from. Hitler, in any case, invented the perpetual motion of conquest without which he would have been nothing at all. But the perpetual enemy is perpetual terror, this time on the level of the state. The state is identified with the apparatus, that is to say, with the sum total of mechanisms of conquest and repression. Conquest, directed outward toward the interior of the country, is called repression or propaganda, the first step on the road to hell, according to Frank. Directed toward the exterior, it creates the army. All problems are thus militarized and posed in terms of power and efficiency. The supreme commander determines policy and also deals with all the main problems of administration. This principle, axiomatic as far as strategy is concerned, is applied to civil life in general. One leader, one people, signifies one master and millions of slaves. The political intermediaries who are, in all societies, the guarantors of freedom disappear to make way for a booted and spurred Jehovah who rules over the silent masses, or, which comes to the same thing, over masses who shout slogans at the top of their lungs. There is no organ of conciliation or mediation interposed between the leader and the people. Nothing, in fact, but the apparatus. In other words, the party, which is the emanation of the leader and the tool of his will to oppress. Think about the combination of Trump's sort of irrational, angry, abusive father shtick, which is actually who he is, combined with the total surveillance state that the internet makes possible, and someone like Elon Musk is definitely trying to help him build. That's the apparatus now. Starlink. In this way, the first and sole principle of this degraded form of mysticism is born. The Führerprinzip, which restores idolatry and a debased deity to the world of nihilism. Trump as God, right? Trump is the anointed. Think of all these bullshit Christians, right? These fake ass Christians laying hands on him and praying over him in the Oval Office as if he is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Medusa's blood, y'all. This is so clear. The parallels are so easy, right? That's because the totalitarian personality, the authoritarian personality, is never anything new in history. It's just this over and over and over and over and over again. And what history has shown us every time, to my fear and my sadness, as a woman who wants power to operate in terms of solidarity, is that we don't get through this by chatting to each other on the socials or having a few demonstrations. What we have come up against, I fear, is a sign that indeed our civilization needs to be on trial. That the center, power, the patriarchal order, sort of male supremacy, white supremacy, these have to be collapsed so that we can build the thing that is going to let people live on a living earth. This is why Medusa Rising thinks in terms of parallel systems of building outward, of trying to not find new space, there isn't any, but actually make new space where women can live, where people can begin building that solidarity, those processes that Heather Marsh calls Steimergy, where the things that we need in terms of trade systems, resource systems, knowledge bases, teaching, learning, the sharing of information, these things emerge naturally, right? By cooperation and interrelation among the groups who create them and need them. Her book, Claiming Chaos, is one of the most useful things. That's the opposite of this nihilism I'm reading to you about. Mussolini, the Latin lawyer, contented himself with reasons of state, which he transformed with a great deal of rhetoric into the absolute, into God, Nothing beyond the state, above the state, against the state. Everything to the state, for the state, in the state. The Germany of Hitler gave his false reasoning for its real expressions, which was that of a religion. Our divine mission, says a Nazi newspaper during a party congress, was to lead everyone back to his origin, back to the common mother. Good Lord. How dare that word be in their mouth? Oh, jeez. It's capitalized, right? Like the goddess. Back to his origins, back to the common mother. It was truly a divine mission. That reversal of the great goddess again, right? That reversal, that destruction, that inversion of sort of the metaphysical feminine principle of the germination and rejuvenation and the emptying of that concept. Look at that. These origins are thus to be found in primitive howls and shrieks. Who is the God in question? An official party declaration answers that. All of us here below believe in Adolf Hitler, our Führer. And we confess that National Socialism is the only faith which can lead the people to salvation. The commandments of the leader, standing in the burning bush of spotlights on a Sinai of planks and flags, therefore, comprise both law and virtue. If the superhuman microphones give orders only once for a crime to be committed, then the crime is handed down from chief to sub-chief until it reaches the slave who receives the orders without being able to pass them on to anybody. One of the Dachau executioners weeps in prison and says, I only obeyed orders. The Führer and the Reichsführer alone planned all of this, and then they ran away. Blüx received orders from Kaltenbrunner, and finally I received orders to carry out the shootings. I have been left holding the bag because I was only a little Hauptscharführer, and because I couldn't stand it. I couldn't hand it on to any lower down the line. Now they say that I am the assassin. This is the work of the perfect hierarchy in patriarchy always, right? In these kind of feudal systems, in these kind of corporate systems. There's this little man down here who eventually has to be the mechanism of the Führer's will, of the God's will, of the state's will. And because he knows that way down there in the mechanisms of that hierarchy, he is only a lever being pulled by a higher power, he feels no culpability for murder of helpless, imprisoned people being destroyed for being the people that they are. Goering, during the trial, proclaimed his loyalty to the Führer and said, there was still a code of honor in that accursed life. The honor lay in obedience, which was often confused with crime. This is where we are. Right now, Trump, Musk, the Trump administration, Bannon, Miller, Vought, all of these like sort of evil geniuses who've come together in one cabal like this. Sebastian fucking Gorka. These guys are right there on that edge, right? They're aiming for a government and a military of obedience. And pretty soon, and we can all feel it, can't we? Pretty soon, obedience, honor, doing the crime, harming the people the way that we are harming immigrants right now, the way that we have been harming Black and brown people and indigenous people in this country for literally centuries. That is going to become confused with honor even more deeply than it used to be, right? And it's not even going to be a race pride thing, although it'll be that. It'll be offerings to the, Orange Julius. Military law punishes disobedience by death, and its honor is servitude. Well, that was during the war. When all the world has become military, then crime consists in not killing if orders insist on it. And that drive, the total militarization of the world, ultimately is the goal of a totalitarian state. Orders, unfortunately, seldom insist on good deeds. Pure doctrinal dynamism cannot be directed toward good, but only toward efficacy, efficiency. As long as enemies exist, terror will exist, and there will be enemies as long as dynamism exists to ensure that. All the influences liable to undermine the sovereignty of the people as exercised by the Führer with the assistance of the party must be eliminated. All influences liable to undermine the sovereignty of the people as exercised by the Führer with the assistance of the party must be eliminated. That which goes against the Orange Julius and MAGA must be eliminated. Enemies are heretics and thus must be converted by preaching or propaganda, misinformation, or QAnon conspiracy theories, or the manosphere, or whatever. Oh, geez. I mean, the themes in pornography. Propaganda exterminated by Inquisition or by the Gestapo. The result is that man, if he is a member of the party, is no more than a tool in the hands of the Führer, a cog in the apparatus, or if he is the enemy of the Führer, a waste product of the machine. The impetus toward irrationality of this movement, born of rebellion, now even goes so far as to propose suppressing all that makes man more than a cog in the machine. In other words, rebellion itself. The Führer, the Orange Julius, their friends, they get to be in rebellion against the internationalism or the woke or the whatever, right? Canada. They're in a rebellion against Canada, of all things. Okay. That is their business. But our business down here, rebellion is not our business. Only obedience is our business. In other words, rebellion itself, the romantic individualism. Ooh, America loves its romantic individualism. Of the German revolutions of the 19th century is finally satiated in the world of inanimate objects. Irrational terror transforms men into objects. Planetary bacilli, according to Hitler's formula. Irrational terror transforms men into objects. This is the collapse that I was talking about in the last video and a little bit in my series on sisterhood coalition and then the next series on fascism, right? When people become pure objects of the state, they become pure mechanisms of the state. They can be turned against each other at any moment. I used to say this about watching Trump's mob back in the first term. Just looking at how he could wiggle his fingers, he could just drop a bit of rhetoric here and there, and these people would go off, right? Or now, as we know, like Republican senators and Congress people and judges are being threatened with death. Their kids' addresses are being shared with them. They're being sent pizza by Trump's mob. These are just regular fucking civilians out there in the world who, when he intimates that someone has gone against him just a little bit, ruffled his feathers a little, even, they descend on that person like the worst of internet trolls, only in real life, right? Swatting them, leaving packages, telling them the name of their dog. Those people are the cogs. Those people are perfectly militarized objects of Trump's state. And they are, for all of their sort of shattered humanity, their nihilism, their absolute servitude to that man, they are dangerous as hell. When I say it's fascism, we're in a condition of new rules. Right here, this transition, where honor lay in obedience, which was then confused with crime, when people become the objects, the planetary bacilli of the state, of the leader. We're right here. This is the moment where we are. They're fungus, bacteria, but they're effective. Oh, rats of France. I lost my place here in the book. Medusa, my girl. Where are the planetary bacilli? There they are. It proposes the destruction. That is this philosophy. Proposes the destruction not only of the individual, but of the universal possibilities of the individual. This is like the 5 freedoms that Timothy Snyder is talking about, or the sort of spontaneous emergent becoming and connection that Heather Marsh is working on in her Chaos series. Only the individual, but the universal possibilities of the individual, of reflection, solidarity, the urge to absolute love. It proposes the destruction of everything that is humane and glorious in our deeply flawed human traditions. Propaganda and torture are the direct means of bringing about disintegration. More destructive still are systematic degradation, identification with the cynical criminal, and forced complicity. Think about all those folks deported who are not gang members. They are not monsters. And really carefully orchestrated set of videos we saw of them being put on the plane and taken off the plane and put in chains and forced to walk bent over and their heads shaved, right? Some of those folks are native, they're indigenous, they're not remotely problematic. And the point here, as Timothy Snyder pointed out in his blog, right, was that systematic degradation. We're seeing that done to them so that we imagine it done to us. And so that then we sit down, shut up, and become objects of the Orange Julius and his friends. The triumph of the man who kills or tortures is marred only by one shadow. He is unable to feel that he is innocent. Thus, he must create guilt in his victim so that in a world that has no direction, universal guilt will authorize no other course of action than the use of force and give its blessing to nothing but success. I hear in this the logic of the rapist, right? The logic of blaming the victim. This is why an unworthy and cruel penitence begins to reign over the world, where only the stones are innocent. The condemned are compelled to hang one another. Even the innocent cry of maternity is stifled, as in the case of the Greek mother who was forced by an officer to choose which of her sons was to be shot. This is the final realization of freedom. The power to kill and degrade slaves, the servile soul from utter emptiness. Sorry. This is the final realization of freedom, this negative nihilistic freedom. The power to kill and degrade saves the servile soul from utter emptiness. See, we're sitting on the edge of that moment in the progress of this, shall we say, rewriting of the social contract, where these degraded people that we've ignored, that NAFTA fucked over, that jobs have not come for, who have been hooked on fentanyl and opioids, right? Who are being fed sugar 24 hours a day through god-awful food chain horrid products that we put on our food markets. The stuff that's cheap is so death, right? So killing them. We're on the edge of that. We're taking their revenge is going to be the thing that justifies all of that suffering. The cruel penitence where only the stones are innocent. The hymn of German freedom is sung to the music of a prisoner's orchestra in the camps of death. The crimes of the Hitler regime, among them the massacre of the Jews, are without precedent in history because history gives no other example of a doctrine of such total destruction, being able to seize the levers of command of a civilized nation. But above all, for the first time in history, the rulers of a country have used their immense power to establish a mystique beyond the bounds of any ethical considerations. The first attempt to found a church on nihilism was paid for by complete annihilation. The destruction of the Liedesy demonstrates clearly that the systematic and scientific aspect of the Nazi movement really hides an irrational drive that can only be interpreted, excuse me, an irrational drive that can only be interpreted as a drive to despair and arrogance. Listen to that combination of things. Despair and arrogance. Does that not feel like the weird emotional construct that we're looking at right now? Until then, there were supposedly only two possible attitudes for a conqueror toward a village that was considered rebellious: either calculated repression and cold-blooded execution of hostages, or a savage and necessary brief sack by enraged soldiers. Leides was destroyed by both methods simultaneously. It illustrates the ravages of that irrational form of reason, which is the only value that can be found in the whole story. Not only were all of the houses burned to the ground, the 174 men of the village shot, the 203 women deported, and the 300 children transferred elsewhere to be educated in the religion of the Führer. But the special teams spent months at work leveling the terrain with dynamite, destroying the very stones, filling in the village pond, and finally diverting the course of the river. They took that rebellious village and they erased it from the earth. They made the place where it had been unlivable. After that, Leides was really nothing more than a mere possibility, according to the logic of the movement. To make assurance doubly sure, the cemetery was emptied of its dead, who might have been a perpetual reminder that once something existed in this place. God, right? Mother, that this be our trajectory. I think we need to put the stops on the wheels soon. The nihilist revolution, which is expressed historically in the Hitlerian religion, thus only aroused an insensate passion for nothingness, which ended by turning against itself. Negation, this time at any rate, and despite Hegel, has not been creative. Let me pause there for a second for those of you who have not read the Phenomenology of Spirit, or shall I say, suffered to read the Phenomenology of Spirit. Negation is that process by which new things emerge in the world, right? And sometimes usually, a negation is created out of the inner tensions within an existing system or an existing paradigm. And a new approach, a new question, a new direction, a new project, often critical of the first one, maybe even violently challenging it, but critical of the first one, emerges from it. And the two kind of like struggle with each other for a while about which one's going to be in control of the world and how people are going to live and what they're going to think. And eventually the new paradigm becomes precedent. It becomes the one that people choose to inhabit more and more and more. It becomes the norm. And eventually that happens again, and that happens again. And Hegel thought that this process would go on forever and ever and ever throughout history until the absolute was realized. And for Hegel, the absolute was the supremacy of the German state. But this process is called the dialectic or the historical dialectic. You'll hear about it in Marxism. You'll hear about it in the Frankfurt School, since they take some of their much more clever, I think, analyses from Marx. You'll hear about it often in like Ricoeur and in other philosophers talking about negation as a process of revivification, of bringing more life into a system. In this case, I fear with the Orange Julius and the neo-reactionaries, as with Hitler, negation would not be creative. It will only be destructive. Negation is the work of the seeker as much as the rebel, right? In relation to her community, as I was saying in my last video. Hitler represents the example, perhaps unique in history, of a tyrant who left absolutely nothing to his credit. Oh, God, when Camus is funny. Hitler represents the example, perhaps unique in history, of a tyrant who left absolutely nothing to his credit. For himself, of his people, and for the world, he was nothing but the epitome of suicide and murder. 7 million Jews assassinated. 7 million Europeans deported or killed. 10 million war victims are perhaps not sufficient to allow history to pass judgment. History is accustomed to murderers. Indeed, we call history begins at murder. But the very destruction of Hitler's final justification, that is, the German nation, henceforth makes this man, whose presence in history for years on end haunted the minds of millions of men, into an inconsistent and contemptible phantom. Now, I live in the United States, as you can tell by my accent. And not only do I live in the United States, I live pretty close to the Capitol. Most of the people that I know here work in 2 worlds. One of those worlds is in government service across a number of agencies that are currently under threat from the Orange Julius and his minions. And the other is sort of the social justice world, feminist activism, a broad swath of social justice issues, working through the arts to change people's perception of their experience. And this idea, and before that, I was trying to be an academic. That didn't work out too great. As I was wanting to talk about sexual difference right at a time when gender was saying, no, no irregular, none of that essentialism. That is not an essentialism. Anyway, the idea that where this all leads, Orange Julius and neo-reactionaries and a new feudalism and a return to the 13th century. I mean, the brain drain has already started in the United States, rendering the U.S. an inconsistent and contemptible phantom. Because I live here, kind of scares the shit out of me. Speer's deposition at the Nuremberg trials, Speers was another one of the Germans, showed that Hitler, though he could have stopped the war before the point of total disaster for the Germans, before the point of total disaster, really wanted universal suicide and the material and political destruction of the German nation. If we're going to lose, we should also all die. I don't think these people have that kind of courage. They probably have something a little slower and a little stupider out there in the future for us. If the German people are incapable of victory, they are unworthy to live, said Speers. Hitler therefore decided to drag them with him to the grave and to make their destruction an apotheosis. When the Russian cannon were already splitting apart the walls of his palace in Berlin, Hitler, Goering, who wanted to see his bones placed in a marble tomb, Goebbels, Himmler, Ley, killed themselves in dugouts or in cells. But their deaths were deaths for nothing. They were like a bad dream, a puff of smoke that vanishes. I mean, a puff of smoke that led pretty wide swath of death and unforgivable violence in their wake. Neither efficacious nor exemplary, they consecrate the bloodthirsty vanity of nihilism. That is, they ended up consuming all of those people. They ended up consuming all of those people for their own drive toward nothingness. What I fear right now in the far right, in its racism, in its xenophobia, in its corporatism, in its neo-reactionary, uh, hyper-feudalist dreams, is that it will be a drive toward nothingness, that it will leave great swaths of us dead or wishing we were in a world that will be utterly poisoned and burning and drowning and dying around us. It's why I want to build out there away from this as fast as we can go. They thought they were free, Frank cries hysterically at the trial. Didn't they know that no one escapes from Hitlerism? They did not know, nor did they know that the negation of everything is itself a form of servitude, and that real freedom is an inner submission to a value which defies history and its successes. Now, if that's not a sense of meaning. But the fascist mystics, we're almost done. I know this is taking a very long time. But the fascist mystics, even though they aimed at gradually dominating the world, really never had pretensions to a universal empire. At the very most, Hitler astonished at his own victories, was diverted from the provincial origins of his movement towards the indefinite dream of an empire of the Germans that had nothing to do with the universal city. Russian communism, on the contrary, by its very origin, openly aspires to world empire. That is its strength, its deliberate significance, and its importance in our history. Despite appearances, the German Revolution had no hope of a future. It was only a primitive impulse whose ravages had been greater than its real ambitions. Russian communism, on the contrary, has appropriated the metaphysical ambition that this book describes, the erection after death of God, of a city of man, finally deified. The name revolution, to which Hitler's adventure had no claim, was once deserved by Russian communism, and although it apparently deserves it no longer, it claims that one day it will deserve it forever. Think about who Julius's daddy is, right? Think about who that guy was under communism. For the first time in history, a doctrine and a movement based on an empire in arms has as its purpose definitive revolution and the final unification of the world. It remains for us to examine this pretension in detail. Hitler, at the height of his madness, wanted to fix the course of history for 1,000 years, permanent Republican majority. The neo-feudalism of these neo-reactionaries, a return to what they believe the sort of natural social contract is for human beings, right? This weird little side quest we've been on for 5,000 years called patriarchy. They think that's our norm. He believed himself to be, Hitler that is, he believed himself to be on the point of doing so, fixing the course of history for 1,000 years. And the realist philosophers of the conquered nations were preparing to acknowledge this and to excuse it when the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad threw him back on the path of death and set history once more on the march. But as indefatigable as history itself, the claim of the human race to divinity is once more brought to life with more seriousness, more efficiency, and more reason under the auspices of the rational state as it is to be found in Russia. Now be careful there, because that was a place of absolute servitude as well. This doesn't work out this way. In this series I'm working on about fascism, I wanted to stop and read from this book specifically because the aridity the vacuousness we can feel in these men's souls when we hear them speak, when they talk of their ambition. That gets people chewed up. That gets people ground down. That lets the old and the young, the sick and the frail and the infirm die, so that the young and the strong and the able are better, less distracted in their labor for the state or their feudal lord, their corporate. Let us be careful, yeah? Let us be careful as we move into the resistance to this, that we are going to have to form, not just radical materialist feminists, but many of us. I know, it's a depressing little essay. It's kind of a sad little book. But Camus was really good at this and telling it that it was legitimate, like anything else, but that his insistence on real human being, on the adventure of us, on our authenticity, our unpredictability, our mobility, our knowledge making, our love for each other, commitment to each other. He knew that that could be stronger, these guys. And their sad little computer cars, and their orange makeup. Weird dreams of a reasserted masculine station. It's such a small dream, isn't it? I mean, it looks like a big project. Looks like a big project. Taking down the American government, rolling back 80 years of history. It looks like a big project, but it's actually a really small fucking dream. And as I said in part one of It's Fascism New Rules series, you have to have a dream bigger than your oppressor if you want to win. And if you check us out over at medusarising.org, you read the work of radical, you'll see that our dreams are quite large. All right, I've been talking to you forever. Thank you if you listened all the way through this, or if you listened to it in parts and came back in bits and pieces, because Jesus, an hour is a long time. But yeah, Gaia is a goddess of life, death, and regeneration. She is negation and creation. So let's enact all that, right? Let's enact all that for each other. Keep your head down and your chin up. Do not comply.